Hey there, and welcome to Painting Massive Darkness. The purpose of this tutorial is to show you some of the processes and techniques I use to paint my own Massive Darkness game. My aim is to provide a new or uncomfortable painter with enough information to successfully paint through their game while still leaving the door open for more advanced techniques and experimentation. If you are a more experienced painter, welcome, and I hope you find this entertaining. Please feel free to leave any additional advice below. Oh, and you may see a card in the top right corner from time to time. These link to additional videos that further explain a particular process in more detail. So if you're a little confused and you see a card during that segment, that may just clear things up for you. Some of the content is on other channels though, so please keep that in mind. Let's paint the giant spider. But before we paint our giant spider, there's a little bit of cleanup you may want to consider doing. This should pay dividends in the later phases of painting. You may want to wash the miniature, look for and remove any mold lines, additionally, fill any gaps or imperfections if you find any. The giant spider's base has both the largest size and open surface area of all the miniatures in the base game. This provides a unique opportunity to explore several different basing techniques. This is entirely optional, and if you're a new painter, you may just want to go ahead and skip this aspect of the tutorial for now. It's easy enough to add these elements at a later date. At this point, you may want to consider adding a thin coat of a plastic bonding primer like Krylon Fusion to the base before gluing anything to it. You don't have to, I didn't, but in my testing I found it to be a slightly more secure foundation. After looking at some of the game boards for inspiration, I decided I wanted 3 basic floor types: flagstones, rubble, and the dirt floor itself. I'm tracing some lines on the base here to help me roughly visualize where I want these elements to transition. I've decided to sculpt the flagstones about 2 millimeters high with some putty. I'm using green stuff, but many other putties will work just as well. Don't worry about being particularly precise, as some inconsistencies will only add to the worn look. Next, I've decided to build my rubble out of some 4mm cork sheets. I recommend cutting the cork in half with a craft knife. This keeps our base from becoming too thick, as well as creating a new, rougher surface. Cut the width and length of the cork to taste and try to dry fit the pieces on the model to ensure you have what you need. When you're happy, thoroughly cover the entire area with a generous coat of PVA or craft glue. I used a little water here to help me spread the glue a bit easier. Keep in mind that some of your cork may hang over the edge of the base. We'll cut those later. I've added some more glue to cover the remainder of the base. I'm using 2 sizes of sand here. A larger, coarser sand and a mix of small and fine grains of sand. I'm adding the large sand first to represent some of the larger stones. I'm adding more of them next to my flagstones, and especially the rubble, to represent smaller pieces that may have chipped away over time. I'm immersing the base with my mix of smaller sands, making sure I have sand over the entire surface. Lightly shake off any extra sand and wipe off the edges. Press the sand very lightly into the putty if you want a rough texture. Otherwise, you can remove most of it with a little light brushing. Once your putty has started to harden, sculpt whatever design makes you happy into the putty with a sculpting tool or a small knife. After I achieved full happiness, I decided to apply a light top coat of watery PVA glue to the sand, cork, and putty to help seal the sand grains in. Let the glue dry completely before cutting the cork flush to the base. I had a few spots that did not adhere well and came up a little bit, so I just went ahead and reinforced those areas with some superglue. I'm going to prime this bugger with zenithal highlights. That doesn't count as a pun because I'm starting with a coat of black primer, taking special care to cover the undersides of the figure. Then I spray some lighter tones, first with gray from a 45-degree angle, and finally with white from overhead. You can of course prime all one tone, but the effects of the zenithal will carry through even a couple of thin coats of paint, and make the job of shading and highlighting much easier with little effort. The giant spider is an amazing opportunity to practice some wet blending. Since the arachnoid form is already so alien, there's little risk of my friends negatively critiquing my paint job like they might with a more humanoid figure. Therefore I'll be wet blending using 4 colors: Incubi Darkness, Cantor Blue, Nagaroth Night, and Screamer Pink. I'll also be adding some acrylic retarder at a roughly 1:6 ratio, as well as some flow aid or water to thin the mix slightly. I'm happy with this consistency. You may have noticed that I'm using a wet palette for this, but you could use a plastic plate or a tile if you have enough will and passion to compensate. Let's begin with painting a healthy helping of incubi to the nether regions of the spider. Once it looks modest enough, switch to Cantor Blue and roughly paint the bottoms of the legs and start blending the dark blue with the blue-green of the incubi that is still wet on the figure. Next, paint some Nagaroth Night over the top of the spider, blending into the blues. At this point, the figure should be completely covered in paint. Now that we've switched to Screamer Pink, I'm reducing the amount of paint on my brush, slowly blending and working up the intensity of the hot pink. I ended up painting much of the upper abdomen with blended Screamer Pink. Using a fairly dry brush, I'm adding a layer or two of Emperor's Children in 4 stripes on the back. I actually want the appearance of brush strokes as it resembles the furry texture shown on the box art. Once the first layer of paint has dried, feel free to go back using any of the previously mentioned colors to clean up any areas or to create an interesting effect. Like I tried here on the thorax. Eventually I painted the mandible and bony protrusions with storm vermin fur to add a bit of tonal contrast and emphasis on the face, although this differs a bit from the box art. I painted the eyes with a bright Evil Sun Scarlet. I decided to paint the base with some cheap craft paints that should be found at any local craft store or hypermarket. This is a great way to save a little money if you paint enough terrain. I used a light gray similar to storm vermin fur to paint the stones. A khaki, not unlike a Shabti bone on the bare ground. and a deep brown mixed with some orange to create a reddish brick color pretty similar to Mournfang brown. I am also using the gray and brown to paint some of the larger stones and gravel throughout the base. I decided to add a little mold to the rubble by stippling some Lauren Forest, although any deep green should give the effect. So our spider should already be looking pretty good, but I decided to add some simple shading to increase the contrast, mitigate small blending mistakes, and generally tie the figure together even further. For this, I'm using Army Painter's Dark Tone Quick Shade. I think the viscous, oil-based nature of the shade pairs well with the blending on the spider, as well as the basing components I've used. As an added bonus, since I'm only using one shade, the process is very quick. Wow, look how fast that was. Before the shade becomes tacky, I'm removing any unwanted oil with a brush and mineral spirits, or a damp paper towel. Set aside Spider-Man for at least 12 hours to dry. Once dry, I'm adding a light coat of matte varnish. This will make painting highlights much easier than over the gloss. Alternatively, you could just paint the rim of your base and start playing the game at this point. I'm going to begin with applying a dry brush of Scrag Brown to the rubble. Be mindful not to cover areas of shadow or our green mold. I'm following this up with a light touch of Deathclaw Brown on the upper edges and corners. I'm switching to a spotter brush and stippling a little bit of Elysian green on top of the mold. I'm attempting to dry brush the stone with Administratum Gray. You can see I added too much here, but it's nothing I can't fix with a little Nuln Oil. I'm dry brushing the floor with Ushabti Bone. Notice how I'm picking out certain areas with this, avoiding areas of shadow or where we've used previous dry brushes to transition the floor elements. I'm painting some unthinned Emperor's Children to highlight the abdomen. Kind of like a heavy dry brush, but applied with a layer brush. This should give us some hairy looking brush marks. I ended up doing something similar, but a bit more subtle, in the shadowed areas in between with some Naggaroth Night. I added a thin glaze of Carroburg Crimson to help pull this all together, but this can be avoided by simply being a better painter than me. I'm adding a small glint to the eyes with a touch of white, trying to roughly match the position in each eye. I find that a little acrylic retarder can go a long way in giving me the extra time I need to accurately paint small details such as this. I also glazed some white onto the mandibles and bony protrusions. Do this 2 or 3 times, reducing the surface area covered each time. This segment is completely optional, and I would recommend following it more as a rough guide than a step-by-step tutorial. Looking through my potential victims, I ended up deciding I could spare one of my goblin archers. I liked the way its limbs were all flayed out, and I could imagine it being strapped down with little modification. I painted it quickly and shaded it even faster. It can be pretty rough, as most of the model's just going to end up being obscured. I covered the unfortunate goblin with a layer of varnish. Not only does this protect the paint, but it also works pretty well as an adhesive. You'll want to pull some cotton away from a cotton ball, forming a sort of webby blanket. Make sure you only lay down half as much cotton as you would like the final result to be. Find a well-ventilated area where you can spray some varnish onto the webs. I used Krylon Clear Coat, but I recommend testing a small bit of cotton yourself if you're unsure of your own varnish. The webs will thicken up and form a more organic looking texture. Any additional cotton can be added while the web is still wet, and the process can be repeated a couple times. I used a gap-filling glue to attach the figure to the base, but an epoxy would work fine too. After the glue dried, I drilled and pinned the model with some super glue and a paper clip, pinning the spider's victim to the dungeon floor. You may want to drill the hole and dry fit the pin earlier to avoid potentially damaging the web, although I think this illustrates how our cotton web should survive some light handling during gameplay. I'm using some gloss to attach some final wisps of cotton to the base. If you haven't already, paint the rim of the base. I'm using Abaddon Black. I'm sealing the monster away with a couple coats of Tester's Dull Coat. Feel free to adjust any of the webbing between coats. I decided to brush on a layer of satin to the entire spider except the abdomen. I used Vallejo satin varnish, but any acrylic satin should produce this effect. And there you go, a spider to enhance your Massive Darkness game and/or Nightmare. Thanks for watching, non-gendered bros. If you enjoyed this, then please let us know by liking the video. If you'd like to see more content like this, let us know and consider subscribing. Additionally, if you found anything helpful when painting your own spider, let us know in the comments. Have a great day, and I'll metaphorically see you in the next video.